Hi, everybody. My name is Rosie Meade, and with my colleague Orla O'Donovan, I am one of the two co-editors of the Community Development Journal. I'm delighted to welcome you to our CDJ YouTube channel, and I hope that you will enjoy the content of this particular video, but that you'll also enjoy engaging with the broader content on our platform. This is the fourth in a series of online dialogues that I have been recording with the authors who contributed to a recent theme section of the CDJ that was published in spring 2021. That theme section focused on territorial stigmatization in theory and practice and its implications for community development. And you can and should, of course, read all the articles on the CDJ website. We hope that these interviews will give you an opportunity to get behind the scenes of the articles in question, to meet the authors, and get a bit of a sense of the ideas, interests, and enthusiasms that are informing their work. We also hope that they will serve as a kind of an introduction and entice you into reading the articles, but also offer a little primer maybe in terms of some of the key debates, concepts, themes, issues, controversies that are surrounding this whole area of territorial stigma and place-based stigmatization. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a colleague from the University of Limerick, Martin Power, and Martin is a sociologist in University of Limerick, which is in Ireland. He's one of the founding directors of the Power Discourse and Society Research Cluster at the University of Limerick, and his research interests include urban sociology, inequalities, and social exclusion. Martin's paper was co-authored with his two UL colleagues, Haynes and Eoin Devereux, and it's called Indelible Stain, Territorial Stigmatization and the Limits of Resistance. And I'm not saying this just because I'm facing him. It is a really great paper, and I would strongly encourage everybody to read it because it offers a really clear, erudite, informed understanding and discussion of this concept of territorial stigma. But it also offers a very grounded and rounded analysis of what that means in the context of real life communities in contemporary Ireland and beyond. In today's discussion, we're going to focus on the key themes and issues discussed in that article, and we're also going to talk a little bit more specifically about stigma and how it relates to life in Limerick City, which is where he's based. Martin, great to see you today. Thanks so much for doing this. It's lovely to have you.
No problem at all, Rosie. Nice to be asked.
Very, very, very good. So we'll maybe start a little bit about the background, I was thinking, and I suppose my sense is that your CDJ article it kind of emerges out of and extends your more long-standing research that you and your colleagues have been undertaking in Limerick. So this is part of a much bigger body of work that you've been involved in for a number of years, and it's focused on life and community in Limerick. And it strikes me that within that research, you've been very interested in themes like reputation and regeneration as they pertain in Limerick. So I'd be really interested if you could talk to us a little bit more about that. Like, what is this research that you've been doing there? What has been the main kind of focus and findings of it? And maybe how it's taken you in the direction of this particular topic of territorial stigma?
Yeah, so I suppose really with myself, Eoin and Amanda, we've been interested in looking at how Limerick City in general, but in particular how the four estates, four local authority estates within Limerick that were designated for the purpose of regeneration under what, at least at that time, was the largest regeneration project in the history of the state. What we were interested in really was how were those places and the people who lived in those represented in the media initially. So our initial work, going back 10 years ago now to 2011, was initially focused on media representations of these particular estates. In particular, we began by looking at an estate called My Ross, which in the national context is probably pretty well known as a location. And so what we were interested in back in 2011 was, how is this area, and by extension, the people who live in that area, how is that portrayed to the general public, both inside Limerick, but also outside of Limerick? So people who know nothing at all about that area. What's the key information that's being presented to people about this location, and by extension, and the people who live there? And again, we found some really kind of interesting things that were being communicated via the media representation of that location at that particular time. We followed that up then by looking at, once we'd figured out what the kind of frame that was being given to people in terms of the message about this place, we then decided that, well, okay, now that we know what's being said, and how these places are being represented, let's talk to the people who did that job. So let's talk to the journalists and the editors, and the people who run the radio stations, who report on this location in this particular way, and let's ask them for their interpretations of why this is. And again, we found some really, really interesting things here, including that a lot of the journalists who wrote about the estate actually were really shocked when they saw what their body of work actually entailed. So quite a number of them thought, for example, that they were quite balanced in terms of what they wrote. And they were very surprised when we were able to show them, well, actually, no, the majority of what you've written actually frames the place in a very negative way. There's very little which actually talks about this location in any kind of positive way. There's no real focus on, the kind of good things about this location. And they were quite shocked by that. And there was one particular phrase that was used in the media at that particular time, which doesn't seem to be used as much anymore, but the phrase, the troubled estate, and that signifier, was essentially acting as a kind of a cognitive prompt for people to tell them what they should think about this location. That was something that was used very heavily in the media coverage that we had tracked up until that point in time. And again, we spoke to a guy who was very high up in the kind of decision-making process in one of the local radio stations. And he was very conscious of the use of that term. So they made a conscious decision in that particular organization not to use that term. And so any news reporting or anything like that on that radio station specifically did not use that term, because they figured out very early the kind of loaded connotations that were associated with that. So again, there was some really interesting stuff that came up there as well, that kind of fed into the whole discourse that was emerging around that time about the impact of the changing nature of journalism. The fact that journalists didn't go out effectively on the beat, so to speak, anymore, to conduct their research and do their work, with a lot more kind of desk-based research being done. So it was really interesting at that time. Then it kind of emerged, for example, that a lot of the stories that were written in national newspapers were written by people who didn't have any geographical insight into Limerick. So they were conflating things which happened in other estates with Ross or with South Hill or wherever. And then a huge element of the kind of really problematic nature of those stories at that particular time were actually the headlines. And again, they weren't being written by the journalists; they were being written by sub-editors. And we had journalists telling us that they had actually refused to have their name associated with stories that they had written, even when they were freelancers, which meant they wouldn't be paid for that work, because of the way that the story had been framed by a sub-editor who would change the content, to make the story more sexy, so to speak, that would sell more papers. So that was the kind of first block of work that we did in kind of 2011, 2012. Again, there was a kind of a number of different publications that we did around that time, which specifically looked at kind of the media representation and how those media representations were put together. I then did some work with Cliona Barnes at the time, where we looked at essentially community safety on the south side of the state. So Ross is on the north side of Limerick, so that was the initial focus, was the north side of Limerick. Then we shifted focus to the south side regeneration estates. So myself and Cliona did a big research study in South Hill and Ballinacurra West in 2011. And again, I suppose one of the really interesting things that emerged from that piece of work, and I'll kind of talk through it as we go on today, but one of the kind of interesting things that emerged from that piece of work was what kind of people in elite positions in Limerick considered to be of interest in relation to community safety and antisocial behaviour and involvement in criminality, versus what people on the estates themselves considered to be antisocial behaviour. Their concern with organised criminality and what they considered to be the really important issues in relation to community safety. So from the elite perspective, the focus was almost entirely on organised crime, which was a real big problem in Limerick at that particular time. But from the residents' perspective, that was almost negligent. or negligible. It didn't really come up. They weren't really interested in it at all. It didn't really concern them. But what really concerned them were small things, like, for example, when people were moved out of housing, that the council at the time didn't turn off the water at the mains, or didn't disconnect the gas or the electricity or whatever. And what was happening then was kids were going in and stealing the copper wire and stealing the copper tanks and selling on the metal. And then the houses were flooding. And and there was a risk of fires, and so residents that's what they considered to be of interest in terms of community safety. They were really interested in those kinds of things. So I suppose what really came out of that study for me anyway was the disconnect between what officialdom saw as being of importance versus what those who lived on the estates on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis, saw as being important. And there was a huge disconnect there. Then we moved on, kind of 13, 14, we moved on to look at, again, representations, media representations, but of the south side estates, so of Ballinacurra Weston and Moyross, so that we could have a kind of an overarching picture for the city as a whole. And again, no surprise to find that, the majority of coverage, the overwhelming majority of coverage, was about crime. It was about deviance. It was about, how these areas were essentially out of control, kind of beyond the pale. And that regeneration then essentially was the only game in town in terms of solving these people's problems. And then we did what I still consider to be a really kind of interesting paper. One of the most interesting things I worked on, actually, was the representations of Moyross and other stigmatized neighborhoods in Limerick by Google Street View. And that was really, really interesting, because for me, it kind of showed how the dominant narratives about these areas actually filtered out into the ether, out into social media, and actually influenced the decisions which were taken by these major global companies. Yeah. So much so that those companies wouldn't even send a car into some of those locations in this city to take photographs of the streets, right? And what happened as a consequence of that then over time, because of complaints and people kind of saying, well, you're playing up to the stereotype. So initially, the only representation on Google Street View of Moyross was a photograph which was taken from the other side of this really big wall in a neighboring middle-class estate. So it was literally looking into this estate. So it was almost voyeuristic looking into it. Over time, they took more photographs on the outside of Moyross, which were, again, along the kind of access roads on the outskirts of the estate. So there was no real internal mapping at all from the point of view of Google Street View. So the images that were being represented were on the outskirts looking in of an area that, essentially was reinforcing the image that these are places that you shouldn't go. If you don't,
these are no-go areas, actually, isn't it?
You don't go in there.
Yeah.
Eventually, they did map the internal structure of the estate. But again, because of the kind of rapidly changing nature, because this was an area undergoing regeneration, a couple of years after many areas had effectively been cleared, they were now fully green areas. The images that were representing these areas on Google Street View to the world were of burnt out housing, demolished housing, really poor kind of, poor location, which no longer existed. So again, it was reinforcing the stereotype by presenting an area which didn't exist any longer. And so again, then we kind of moved focus then from that to looking at, let's start looking at, and it was a small bit in the initial work that we did around media representations of Moyross in terms of the residents' interpretations of those in those representations. So kind of 2016, 17 onwards, then we started to look at, and that was ultimately, I suppose, what was a big part of the feeling safe in our community study that I did with Cliona, was actually, let's ask the residents, let's ask the people who are the real experts here, let's ask the people who live here what they think. And so that's what we did. We began then to talk to them about their perceptions of what it was like to live in an area that's undergoing regeneration. So it shifted a bit from just their interpretations of the media coverage of this area, that still played a part, to, well, what's your understanding of living in an area which has been uniformly stigmatized? How does that impact upon your life? And are there things that you've been able to do as residents of these locations to change that narrative, in some way, shape, or form? And that's why when initially this project came up, this special edition on territorial stigma, and we began to think about the paper that we wrote, in terms of, well, let's look at what we've done over the last 10 years and try to put that together as this kind of bigger overarching piece to see, well, what can we now say about territorial stigma in the context of Limerick? How has it impacted upon people? What way does it manifest? Who does it serve? And ultimately, I suppose, is there anything that can be done to challenge that? So from that perspective, it was a really interesting piece to write in terms of trying to reflect on what we've been doing over the last 10 years to see kind of, well, where do we stand now? What can we say about Limerick and why it's newsworthy, etc. in this particularly kind of stigmatized lens.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think, like, you don't sort of consciously do it in the course of the article, but certainly for me reading it, I felt it was a kind of a culmination of a kind of a long history of research in that it was building on kind of a very rich understanding that had been developed over time. And that was, that had different components to it. So it certainly comes through very, very strongly. I think it's interesting as well. I mean, it's even some of the comments that you're making in relation to the disconnect between, for example, the local authority and residents. I mean, they're kind of central struggles in relation to community development, aren't they? Do you know what I mean? The whole purpose of community development is to sort of to bridge that so that we're no longer in a situation of what's happening in communities is being done to them, but that we would hope that it would be done by them, for them, with them, or any of those other prepositions you might want to throw in there. But there is really still a very strong sense in which community development is actually being directed based on notions of deficit, notions of failure, notions of communities that are troubled, no-go areas that need to be corrected and managed in some kind of way. Do you know? And I think that's the real tension for us, for instance, in community development is, on the one hand, we think this is what it could be, this kind of more participatory, empowering notion of what community development is about, versus the reality that so much of it is mired in this kind of set of ideas around failed people and failed places that need to be redirected and kind of governmentalized in a Foucauldian sense, which is, obviously, like how I often try and conceive of it in that way, but there are lots of other ways you could talk about this stuff. So I think, in terms of what you said there, that comes through really, really strongly, and it's a recurring dilemma for, I think, everybody who's listening to this, video will be able to kind of relate to that particular tension that you're describing there. I suppose just building on from what you said there, then I suppose this whole theme section is about territorial stigmatization, and that's a concept that's very much associated with McConk. How useful do you think it has been, or is useful for you and your colleagues in terms of making sense of the dynamics of inequality and oppression that are at play in a place like Limerick? What does a concept like that bring to our understanding in terms of how the kind of factors you've been describing there, the misrepresentation, the misunderstanding, the kind of gap between the kind of policymakers and people? What extra does, I suppose, that concept bring to our understanding of what's going on with that?
I think quite a lot. I think territorial stigma, as it was kind of derived by Wakant and operationalized by people like Tom Slater, for example, I think that it kind of really encapsulates the different kind of discursive strategies that are used, which are then, which are used to very clearly and symbolically demonize these places and their residents, to construct these pathologized areas and pathologized people. And at a deeper level, I think what that concept of territorial stigma allows us to do is to see how these processes essentially are an exercise in symbolic power, who holds it and who doesn't. And I suppose by representing places as beyond the pale or beyond kind of normal society, like you said, that both policy and as we focused on quite heavily, the media discourses, they essentially take away the power or the ability of residents to really, I suppose, occupy or to render their own individual space to essentially have some form of influence over elite interventions. And I think if you're looking at kind of the concept of territorial stigma, I think it's key really in highlighting how, particularly in recent decades, and it seems to be a process that's just ever increasing, and actually speeding up. Like neoliberal policy is now globally dominant, and these media framings that I spoke about a few minutes ago essentially have transformed very clearly and very effectively, discursively. Like I said, they act as kind of cognitive prompts or cognitive triggers, which have transformed these disadvantaged areas and the people who live in them, the communities who live in them, from being a symbol or a symptom of inequality to being the cause. So, there's been this huge focus, for example, on things like neighborhood effects, as if these effects exist, almost in isolation from the structures of society, that it's the estate that causes these problems, and the people who live there that cause those problems. And stigma is hugely important, because stigma is the device that effectively legitimates individual responses on the part of the state. So it's essentially, stigma facilitates an individuating response to what is essentially a structural problem. And again, that has had enormous impact in terms of the responses on both a global, a national, and a local level. And again, Imogen Tyler's book there last year on stigma is really, really powerful in terms of how that process actually happens. And so essentially, this whole process of stigma politics as part of the process of territorial stigmatization, really, I suppose, is useful and was useful to us in terms of writing that paper, in terms of being able to show the effective weaponization, really, of stigma by political elites, to essentially to legitimate and legitimize the deepening divisions that occur in this instance, Irish society. We've had a situation whereby territorial stigma and these areas and the people who live in those areas have often been blamed for their own misfortune, and there's been a complete abdication on the part of the state in many instances, not just in Limerick, but in numerous locations throughout the state. There's been a complete abdication of the state for any responsibility for what's happening in these locations. Yeah. So I think territorial stigma as a concept is really useful to enable you to kind of unpick all of that, to be able to look at it and say, well, why? Because when you look at a lot of these decisions that are being taken, you kind of go, how does that make sense? Like, well, why would that approach be being taken? You're looking at some things that were done and you're going, you're really, really struggling to find any justification for why that policy was pursued. Mm-hmm. But if you apply, a lens which incorporates the concepts of territorial stigma, and you're including things like, kind of the context of, Ireland becoming more and more of a neoliberal welfare state in terms of its operation versus its rhetoric, then these decisions begin to make sense, right? So you can see why a certain policy decision is taken, because it's a justification for a different, more overarching policy. So I think territorial stigma is a really useful concept. At least it was a very useful concept for us in terms of kind of putting all of this together in terms of a body of 10 years work and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I think that I suppose in terms of what Con's usage, it is linked to this notion of advanced marginality and the kind of the tendency of the state to adopt more penalizing and more punitive approaches to welfare, the imposition of greater conditionality, neoliberalization. So, I mean, and the fact that in a context like Ireland, that is a real thing. Do you mean there is a real kind of, and there's a temporality that's going on with that as well, is that you sort of like construct people as, as wanton, undeserving, as blemished. Do you know what I mean? Then it becomes easier to impose certain kind of conditions on welfare. Do you mean like the rationalization is set up? And actually, I don't know if you've seen it, but have you that film The Fourth Act, which is about the regeneration of Ballymun? Have you seen that film? It's really worth looking at it. Yeah, I think it's actually even available. Sorry for the non-Irish listeners now at this instead of like parochial talk about Irish TV shows and stuff, but on the Virgin Media Player. And it's yeah, but it's actually and I might include a reference to it on our website as well, because I think it's a really, really good film for anybody who's in community development. It's about the regeneration of Ballymun, and what it includes there's a lot of found footage from within Ballymun of people just knocking about, living their life in the community, doing all sorts of things, playing games, going to discos, all that sort of stuff. And then there are interviews with various people who are involved in the Ballymun regeneration. And I suppose, and it's not everybody that does this, but some of the conversation, the way that the community is talked upon, almost as at times a place where like, this is like a blank canvas. Do you know what I mean? Like it's an estate that's not really an estate. Do you know what I mean? There's certain kind of assumptions about, and so kind of like that kind of notion of like failure or not working or a problem to be solved. And at the background, there's a lot of big ideas around how can we make Ballymun more ripe for investment? Do you know what I mean? How can we stop it being a blemish on the way to the airport in Dublin? And I think so like those kind of neoliberal considerations are actually very much part of what was going on there as well. And I think it's not, these are coming from people who are involved as officials within the process. You know what I mean? And not just accusations being thrown at, by people in the community.
I mean, we saw the same thing in Limerick, like literally after, within a few weeks of the regeneration project being set up here. Like one of the first developments was this huge billboard hoarding appeared on the green at Watchhouse Cross on the entrance to my Ross, which said, I'm not sure if it said Limerick regeneration or just regeneration, I can't remember, but it said regeneration, building communities. Mm-hmm. And so this was basically put up on the green on the entrance into my Ross, despite the fact that my Ross has had a hugely, integrated community for a long period of time. It's, if you look at any of the books on community development, looking at Ireland, my Ross is one of the areas where they always talk about this very strong integrated community. But yet when officialdom came to town, that the first thing that was put there was that regeneration was actually going to create a community. Many people would argue that it actually decimated the communities in Limerick. That's for later on maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it's very interesting. And I think that notion of this kind of enterprise culture and this kind of punitive culture, I think is also quite central to the kind of framing of this particular stigma. I suppose I'm kind of assuming that many of the listeners won't know Limerick or won't be from Ireland at all, or, are not even from Europe, which is fantastic. But would you mind maybe just giving a little bit more detail of what territorial stigmatization actually means for a place like Limerick? Like, what are we talking about being said or done about the people in the communities there?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing would be that Limerick itself is kind of interesting because it's very socially and spatially uneven, and those spatial differences are reflecting the different kind of socioeconomic status within the city. So again, some people have argued that Limerick's kind of really interesting because essentially it's two cities within one, and you have very high levels of affluence and disadvantage in very close proximity to each other. Mm-hmm. Which makes it kind of unusual. And even during the Celtic Tiger boom period in Ireland, where we were literally generating money hand over fist, generating so much of it we didn't know what to do with it. So we were running economic surpluses for a number of years. But even during that economic boom period, certain neighbourhoods in this city were characterised by extraordinarily high levels of unemployment, very high levels of poverty, antisocial behaviour, organised criminality, low levels of education. So you had this very obvious socioeconomic difference that manifests itself in the city spatially. Mm-hmm. In terms of territorial stigma, it's experienced in Limerick as elsewhere, of course, as a very negative process. Which undermines in Limerick, it undermines the relationships between individuals and between many service providers, particularly state service providers. Again, residents of the 4 estates that I've been talking about are often seen as being separate and distinct from the broader Limerick population. And I would argue, as many others would, that the stigmatized reputation of those estates has probably been the single most significant challenge to the well-being of those estates and the people who live there. In terms of the residents that we've spoken to over a long period of time, they talk about they give you numerous examples in the work that we've done to now about how the stigmatized identity of their estates has translated into prejudice and differential treatment in terms of access to things like insurance cover, the costs of insurance, mortgages, the refusal of things like taxi services, for example, to come and collect them on estates. We had somebody talk about the fact that she was refused a mortgage of €50,000 to buy a house near her parents in one of these estates, but she would have been given a mortgage of 200,000. She would have been approved for a mortgage of 200,000 to buy a house in an estate 5 minutes away because it wasn't that estate. So the bank essentially was saying, well, we'd prefer to give you 200 grand on a mortgage than 50 grand because our money is safer on the higher amount. So things like that. They also very clearly, the stigmatized reputation of these places also very clearly shapes residents' engagement with welfare, with education, with community support services in the disadvantaged communities in Limerick. Very, very clear from talking to residents that they perceive that their concerns and voices are ignored or rarely heard in the political sphere in particular, and by officialdom in general, that their concerns are not taken seriously, and that's led to them becoming disillusioned over time, which you could make the argument is the point of ignoring them in the first place. If you ignore them for long enough, they'll go away and stop voicing these concerns in the first place. There was a very strong belief among some of the residents that we talked to that things like arson, joyriding, burglary, general kind of vandalism, low-level antisocial behaviour, all of these kinds of stuff, that they're not taken as seriously by the police or by the local authorities when they're happening in those communities. That there's a belief, and again, I'm not saying that this perception is entirely accurate, but perception is reality for these people. So if that's what they perceive, then that's their reality. So they believe that these things are not taken as seriously as if they were happening in more middle class neighborhoods in the city, and they believe that essentially those kinds of issues are seen to be innate or natural to these places, and as long as they're happening within those boundaries, within those territorial boundaries, that official Limerick is happy enough, as long as it's in there. If you step outside of those boundaries and it starts happening in the city centre or in middle class neighbourhoods or wherever, that's a different problem. Then that needs to be cracked down on. And again, I suppose the media coverage, which I've said is almost overwhelmingly negative, that has an impact on also in terms of how those areas and the people who live in those areas are perceived, both internally and outside of those areas. So, for example, there's been work done which shows that those locations outside of Limerick often trigger fear, or they're considered to be no-go areas or places that you wouldn't go. And I remember myself, and again, I grew up on a local authority estate. I remember being home before I did work in one of those estates at one time, and one of my friends had said that he might be coming to Limerick the following week. He said, I'll give you a shout. And I said, actually, I'll be in X next week. I'll be doing a bit of work out there. And his response to me was, well, will you have a Garda escort when you're out there? And I was saying, why would we have a Garda escort? Well, you'd be working there, like, and that place is a bit mental, like, and I was kind of going, it's exactly the same as where we grew up, exactly the same. It's just bigger. And but again, his interpretation of this place was because he had no direct contact with the place or anybody from there. So his knowledge of what that location was entirely derived from its representation in the media. So that has implications. And I suppose the last and probably the most important aspect of all of that is that kind of territorial stigmatization then has tangible impacts for the individuals who live there. But it also produces or influences the type, as you mentioned earlier, it influences the type of policy interventions that territorial stigmatization then legitimizes. Yeah. So in a sense, it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the representation of those areas dictates the policy response, which, if it's based on essentially false information, doesn't have the desired effect, which leads to residents becoming even more disillusioned with the whole process in the first place. And you can see that in terms of how the whole regeneration process has evolved over time. And if you look at regeneration over the last 5-6 years in Limerick, it has moved significantly from being, entirely focused on the 4 estates to now being a regeneration project which prioritizes the creation of more spaces for consumption, particularly within the city centre and the commercial districts of the city, rather than any real direct intervention in the stigmatized communities in the city anymore. Yeah. And again, the territorial stigma associated with those areas has had an impact in the evolution of policy. And you can see that if you look across the different policy documents in terms of how regeneration is understood and the way that regeneration is going to be delivered over a longer period of time. It has evolved very significantly.
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of crucial argument, is that, like, sometimes when I imagine people who think the word stigma, they think of something that purely exists at the level of symbolism. Do you know what I mean? Like that it's sort of like awful and wrong and unfair and it's soul destroying, but it's not just those things. I mean, stigma generates material effects. It actually has creates tangible problems for people in their everyday lives, in the sense of like opportunities limited, opportunities never known. Do you know, like, so like the sort of the scale and scope of people's lives are really hemmed in, I think, as a consequence of it. But also that kind of endless feedback loop between media and policymakers about how, this is all they're good for. This is all, do you know, we can offer. So I think that sense of, but I think it's coming through very strongly in the kind of contemporary research around stigma, that this is not just a matter of, like reputation or representation alone, although they also really, really matter. It also has a material effect in terms of how people experience the world, in terms of economy, in terms of society, in terms of culture, in terms of all of those different dimensions as well, So I think that comes through really strongly there in terms of what you were describing. And also, I suppose, that kind of way that I think is quite interesting about how people can feel empowered to know so much about a place they don't know at all, that they've never been to, that they've no direct line of communication, but the assumed kind of assumption that they already know about it. I find that a kind of a really interesting kind of cultural phenomenon, because again, you can see what that kind of, like unknowingness allows to happen. Do you mean what it actually, like that kind of going along with the kind of conventional assumptions about places, all the kind of inequalities and injustices that actually allows flourish, because that is so strong, I suppose we've been talking very much about Limerick, obviously, in terms of, because it's central to your research, but do you think that there's something particularly going on in Limerick? Do you mean like that there's some particular tendencies in terms of how Limerick communities are represented? Or do you think that the same or similar things are happening in other urban communities in other parts of Ireland and maybe beyond Ireland, but perhaps in Ireland is probably easier, just in terms of the scale of discussion we're having?
I suppose the short answer is no. I don't think there's anything peculiar or unusual about Limerick in particular. I think it the kinds of stigmatization, particularly in the media representations of those areas, can be replicated and is replicated in other parts of the country as well. A couple of kind of interesting quotes that just kind of pop into my head from some of the people who took part in the earlier body of work that we did. One was from a journalist who, when we asked a kind of a similar question to what you've just asked, his response was, when we were talking about kind of why Limerick, because Limerick as a city as well, is stigmatized in terms of it had this reputation, this label which was attached to it a number of decades back of Stab City, which has again traversed the globe. That's how far that description has traveled. And I was asking the journalist about that at the time, that kind of label that was attached, and his response was kind of really interesting, because what he said was, well, everywhere needs a waste paper basket, essentially, that you can dump on. And he said Limerick is Ireland's waste paper basket as a city. And then within Limerick, there are
waste paper basket.
There are places like Moyross and wherever that people dump on then as well in that area. He was talking about how that might not necessarily reflect reality, but that's what happens. And then the second kind of interesting thing that kind of jumped into my head was just in response to the impact of these kinds of representations. And when you were talking about how people have no knowledge of areas, and they get their information and they interact with an area then based on that information. And it was really interesting that one of the participants in one of the early studies that we did spoke in the same way, actually, but when she went to Dublin. So she was saying there were certain parts of Dublin that she was terrified of going into. And I was saying, well, why? And she goes, well, it's because of what you read in the papers. But she was also knowledgeable enough to say, well, this is kind of mad, because I know what's written about where I live in the papers doesn't reflect my reality, right? That's not what happens all of the time. She said, and I know that when I'm reading it in the papers about Dublin, that's likely to be the same situation, that that's not what happens there all the time. But it has a tangible impact on me when I go to those areas. So she was kind of saying, so I get why people are afraid of this this particular location in Limerick. So I kind of thought that little discussion kind of really captures just the power of how these stigmatized identities actually, attach themselves to a place, and by extension, and the people who live there. But I suppose to answer your broader question, I don't think there's anything particularly distinctive about the way that the working class communities in Limerick City are represented or treated relative to how other working class communities in this particular country are treated. It's the same as if you're talking about working class communities in West Dublin or in parts of Dundalk or wherever. I think it's the same. I think the process is the same. Maybe Limerick is if you're talking about it maybe in terms of league tables, that Limerick is at the top in terms of it has that very recognised stigmatized identity. So there's currency in that for media organisations, because you have that that pre-existing kind of national knowledge. You're already preaching to the converted when you start talking about these in a particular way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I'm from the county, but I've a county of Limerick, but I also have heard that, and like kind of, oh, you're from Limerick, you must be a tough nut kind of stuff, just sort of like ludicrous talk. And I think there's probably a level of notoriety about Limerick, and people can, rattle off names of communities as if they know them without actually knowing them at all, so there is maybe a greater degree of notoriety, but absolutely, I think similar phenomena, so if you, within Cork City, there would be stigmatized neighborhoods within Cork City. And if you drilled into those neighborhoods, you would probably find that there are stigmatized streets within stigmatized neighborhoods so you can keep, drilling down, and it becomes more intense and smaller. I suppose one of the things I want to talk about in relation to this is that we are actually talking about class. A lot of what we're talking about here. I mean, when we're talking to Mia and Rasmus, there was a very strong sense in which the stigmatization that they were talking about in Denmark was highly racialized. Do you mean like there was this kind of ghetto list that they were talking about? So a very strong sense of racialization. I think perhaps in the case of Limerick, it is more about class. Do you know? And I suppose one of the things that's kind of interesting, problematic about the Irish context has been a general unwillingness to talk about class. There's been a kind of a tendency towards denialism, to the extent of people would actually suggest that there's no class in Ireland, but there's class division in Britain, and that's different to us, but we've never really had that problem here, which obviously is not true, but I suppose, but do you think that feeds into what you're describing here in any way, that the kind of lack of class consciousness? And I think there's kind of interesting with the stigmatization, you see a kind of a hyper visibilizing of communities, working class communities, but an invisibilizing them well. So certain elements are kind of brought into very sharp relief, or others are completely disregarded. And I just wondered, how does that broader kind of unwillingness to recognize and think about class, how does that fit maybe in terms of that picture?
Yeah, I 100%. I think Irish society is this self-imagined classless society, like you said, and any kind of class-based discourses have largely been frowned upon since the existence or the foundation of the state in the 20s. And I suppose, despite that, though, like you said, despite that kind of common sense class invisibility, class doesn't exist here, despite that myth of a classless Ireland, because that's exactly what it is. It's a myth. If all you need to do is look at the domination of high status occupations, look at the domination of professionals by the middle and upper classes in this country. It's no different to what's a recognized class-based society like the UK. There's no difference here. It's just that we have self-imagined ourselves as a classless society, and I think if you look at the impact of neoliberalism, neoliberal policies, which are essentially located in class positions, they've largely been accepted even by those who are most marginalized by those very same policies in this country. And those policies have been underpinned by, in Ireland, a particularly strong use of a meritocratic discourse. And I think the two of those things together helped present this public facade of equality to which the state can refer when asked to explain the persistence of inequalities. I think particularly back to the Yes Equality marriage referendum, where you had Fine Gael politicians in particular coming out afterwards and saying, that's it, great, now we're Ireland of equals. Yeah. And I was kind of going, right, well, let's start talking about class inequality and income inequality. If we're going to talk about equality, let's talk about those things. But nobody wants to talk about that kind of stuff. And I do think I think you're totally on the money there when you're saying that kind of myth of a classless Ireland has contributed to the hyper visibilizing and the invisibilizing of working class communities, not just in Limerick but in the country in general. And it has had an impact in terms of how those communities even see themselves, right? So in Understanding Limerick, Niamh Horrigan's book there a number of years ago, Niamh was talking about the advantaged of the disadvantaged and the disadvantaged of the disadvantaged, to kind of go back to what you were saying about individual streets, for example, within stigmatized communities being stigmatized. That's the same with the people who live there. And I suppose in that regards, the work I did with Clean Barnes a number of years ago was really interesting, because it documented the internalizing of a discourse of parental blame amongst the estate residents, where so it wasn't just the state agencies and community workers or members of the police or whatever in Limerick that were actually talking about particular parents being responsible for everything that was going on. And I suppose when you have a situation which encourages people to blame one another for what's happening rather within their communities, rather than focusing on the structural constraints which cause those conditions to occur in the first place, essentially what that does is it absolves the state of any responsibility. It allows the state to continue the process of retraction, which is again a key tenet of neoliberalism. It's what's desired, and all of that is essentially part of what many people are talking about as the class war from above. Yeah. So absolutely, I 100% agree that this myth of a classless Ireland effectively contributes to the way that these estates have been constructed, to the problems that the residents in those areas have to live with on a day-to-day basis, and ultimately they have a huge that myth of a classless Ireland, which effectively then transfers responsibility for success or failure to the individual. Essentially, that dictates the kind of policies that are put in place then to solve the problems of these estates. So class is a huge issue, and in Ireland it continues to be a huge issue in Ireland, and the failure to talk about that or to recognise that has huge implications for actually dealing with what are essentially structural problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that, like, first of all, the lack of I suppose, recognition of economic inequality, but the extent to which that is rooted in structures. I mean, if you don't, and class is one way of approaching that and knowing that and talking about it. So when you cut off that discussion of, like, you ban that word effectively through, then you really are impoverished in terms of really understanding what's actually going on with this. It may not be the only thing that's going on, but it's massively a huge part of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same. It's, again, to go back to that collection that Niamh put together a few years back, the Understanding Limerick thing. One of the, I can't remember which chapter it was, but one of the chapters in that book talked about and was 100% accurate in terms of how, for the bizarre situation where it was more, it was more, what's the word I'm looking for? That it was more rational for young kids in certain parts of the city to want to get involved in organised criminal activity than it was for them to ever even consider going across the city to be a student in UL. That, you might as well have been saying to those individuals that, you're going to the moon. That their sphere of their horizons were so narrow by their class location that, that achieving success in society by conventional means is effectively closed off to them. So, is it a surprise? Effectively, what the chapter was arguing, which I completely agree with, is that these kids were making entirely rational decisions. And that's a huge structural problem that we have to overcome in this country. It's completely wrong that it would be more rational,
of course,
for a kid to choose to join an organised crime gang than to ever think of going to college. But it is more rational for them to do that. Now there have been lots of really interesting stuff being done in the last few years to disrupt all of those networks. I'm thinking of the Garda diversion programs and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not kind of saying it, that situation is still the same. There has been massive work done to undermine those criminal networks in Limerick. My point is more on the kind of rationality that a kid at the age of 10 or 12, in making a rational decision, that it's far more rational for me to do this than to do that. They're structural problems, they're structural issues, and if you don't deal with those as structural issues, then you never deal with them at all. Essentially all you're doing is you might take some of the people who end up being involved in them out of the equation, but you never actually really change the equation, which is
it becomes like a practice of individual rescue, doesn't it? But it doesn't become a kind of a practice of liberation or any kind of critical kind of awareness and sense of community development. Absolutely. I suppose the other thing then is, like, that's very important is, I mean, it's even in the title of your article. So this concept of resistance, and you have some really interesting things to say about that. I think it's a really important part of the discussion you present in the article. And I suppose what you kind of do in that is you draw a little bit on the work of Paul Kirkness and Cecile Cooney, particularly in terms of presenting a kind of, very nuanced, kind of layered up understanding of what resistance means and the different forms that it can take. So would you mind sketching out some of that here, that maybe just even like the different kind of ways that resistance to something like territorial stigma can be conceived of and practiced, and why it's important to talk about that concept of resistance as well?
Yeah, so I suppose when we were looking at this, in terms of writing the paper, and when we looked at kind of the body of work that we put together, what we were interested in and what began to emerge was that there were often these little subtle acts of resistance to the dominant narrative that was being communicated about people. That might have been something as simple as the window box project, for example, in Ross, in terms of changing the image of a place. So they put up, hundreds of these window boxes all over the estate with when all in full bloom, just really changed the kind of the look of the estate, and to represent it in a much more positive way. So it's a really small, subtle thing, but it was, on another level, it was a really important act of resistance by the people who live in the estate, who were saying, actually, what's been written about us is not true. It's not all negative. There are plenty of positive things about living here, and many of the people who live here are very proud to be from this estate, and this is our way of kind of of kicking back at that. So when we looked at it, from a kind of a theoretical perspective, then in terms of trying to make sense of that, again, Paul Kirkness and Cecile Cooney came to the fore in terms of kind of what we were using to explain some of these acts of resistance, and also we drew on Katz's three dimensions of resistance. So I suppose Kirkness was talking about how defiance contains all these multiple possibilities for different forms of action. So from the actions of an individual to something that's intentionally visible, to hidden forms of resistance, which the person who or the group behind the resistance might remain hidden, but the resistance itself becomes obvious. Like, so for example, things like graffiti, for example, would be something that I'm referring to there. It can be from again, Kirkness was talking about how it could be range from the spectacular, so things like civil disobedience, to the mundane, in terms of, again, in the article, the stuff that we tended to focus on was the kind of tactical appropriation or misappropriation of space, particularly by young people within the neighborhoods, and that could be seen as a very powerful form of resistance. In terms of Katz's three forms or three dimensions of resistance, again, we talk about those quite detailed in the article. So oppositional consciousness, resilience, and reworking. In other words, recasting the objects of stigmatization through alternative interpretations. So essentially turning it on its head. And again, I'll give you some kind of good examples of that in a second. In terms of Cooney's kind of approach to responding to stigmatized representations, again, I suppose there was kind of three main approaches that we latched onto here. The first was where the residents themselves kind of separated themselves or absolved themselves from any responsibility for or association with stigma that was associated with the place. So in other words, removing the spoiled identity from them. And again, I kind of mentioned that already in terms of the advantage of the disadvantaged, the disadvantage of the disadvantaged, or the appropriation of parental.
It's that crowd over there, but it's not myself.
Exactly. Exactly. So that was kind of one of the strategies that was used. The second one that Cooney talks about was introspection. And that was really where residents' perceptions of their location was grounded on internal perspectives, without references to the external stigmatized identities. So that was about essentially the residents themselves, the pride that they had in their own location and their own neighborhood, and how that was expressed. And again, I suppose the example I used about the My Ross window boxes, for example, might be one of those forms of resistance. And then the third one was where the residents of a stigmatized neighborhood would essentially respond in kind by essentially defaming the majority society, which is again really kind of interesting. But I suppose overall, what was also kind of enlightening, but I suppose also quite depressing, was that resistance in these forms was shown by Kirkness, and I suppose by ourselves, that while those kinds of resistance can in some instances improve the lives of the residents, it's often ineffectual, and over the long term, the jury is still kind of out in terms of whether long term those forms of resistance can actually ultimately change anything for the better in the long run. And that goes back to what we were just discussing, which is the fact that the majority of these problems in these estates, the majority of the things that impact upon the residents living in these estates, are effectively structural constraints, which can only or certainly maybe not only, but certainly the state has a massive role to play in that. It can't be just left to the residents themselves to undo the damage of all of this stigma that's been in place for years and years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was like, I mean, I think it's really valuable and important to talk about resistance. And I suppose it was definitely a kind of a corrective, to the accusation that a lot of critical social science was depressing and disempowering and kind of like took the agency away from people. And, and that's, if you were doing sort of social research, you had a responsibility to put in some solutions there. So often I find sometimes that the concept of resistance gets kind of brought in as the kind of, like, oh, well, there's bound to be resistance somehow. Do you mean, like, so I thought was really good about your paper was that you take it seriously, do you mean, on its own terms. So you kind of sort of can respect, okay, potentially it can do these kind of things. And these are not nothing. Do you mean, like, so people having a sense of, well, we feel better about where we live, our pride is, built up. That's not nothing. Do you know, it's an important thing. But to present resistance as a kind of magical solution to structural inequality is also pushing it too far, and I think there was like that maybe even in the context of the article, I think there was an acknowledgement, and you want to talk a bit more about this, that sometimes resistance is also, it's compromise. Do you know, like, and it can even be self-defeating. Do you know, like, so that it actually, in some weird ways, can exacerbate the situation. So it isn't always successful. It's important that we acknowledge it and inspect it closely, but it isn't some kind of magical rupture with how things are either necessarily, Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and then again, I suppose there are also forms of resistance then which can ultimately be self-defeating.
Mm-hmm.
They're entirely understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Why people do certain things. I think, for example, of the riots in the banlieue in Paris, for example, where residents have simply said, we've had enough of this stuff and this, that rioting. But in essence, that's self-defeating, because the powers that be, the apparatus of the state, the London riots is another perfect example. Where the state itself then turned that on its head, said this is not political, this is simply thuggery, and then that's used then as a justification to crack down on those areas even further. So I'm not saying that it's not. That kind of stuff like civil disobedience or even the tactical appropriation of spaces that I talked about earlier. I'm not saying that they're not entirely understandable. They are. But what I'm saying, I suppose, is that they can often be self-defeating because the state will react towards those in a particular way. And I suppose that's what essentially gives the state a get out of jail card if you take the wrong approach. If your resistance is the wrong form, right? Yeah. Again, I think back to the water charges protests in Ireland, right? And again, some of the narrative that kind of creeped in there was that there was an acceptable form of protest. So as long as you're protesting in a certain way, that's fine. But if you overstep that mark, that's a totally different thing. And I think once residents of these areas understand the rules of that game, then they can box very clever. And they can use forms of resistance which get noticed, which get them noticed. And I think that's it. So it's understandable that when people have been consistently kept down, that your natural response might be to lash out. But that's self-defeating in terms of that offers a justification to the state to respond to you in a particular way, which is not the way that you actually need or want.
And if it's not articulated with other kinds of struggle, then it becomes exposed. Do you know, like,
So I think that's problematic in terms of that can take time to develop that knowledge. In saying that, the communities that we worked in Limerick have been very, very clever in terms of the forms of resistance that they've used. A lot of the time it's very simple things. They've gotten very organized. They understand largely how the game is played now, and have done for a considerable period of time. So the kinds of wanton neglect that people living in those areas have experienced and been allowed to, has been allowed to get away with, essentially. I don't think those communities will allow that anymore.
Yeah.
I think they're very clued in. They've got some very clever people involved in terms of representing and articulating the views of the residents of those areas. It's not people who live outside of those areas speaking on their behalf. They're speaking on their own behalf. They're very well organized, very empowered, and ultimately they're the experts. They're the people who live there on a day-to-day basis. They know what they're talking about. The issue is on the other side. The issue is on this, whether the state takes them seriously or not. I'll give you one example of how. So I mentioned earlier about the local radio station, which decided it wasn't going to use a particular phrase that the media were using. One of the other things that we identified in the work that we did on representations of the estates was that there were particular images that had to accompany reports. So you had burnt out houses, boarded up windows, the wandering horse, wandering through the estate. So there were particular things that you would always see in reports to do with particular estates. And one of the things that one group of residents in my Ross did, which was very effective, was they would only be interviewed by media organizations if they were allowed to have their own background hoarding, right? So previously, where somebody might have been interviewed against with a boarded up or a burnt out house in the background, this group had basically got this big hoarding, which they put behind them, which essentially blocked out anything that they didn't want shown about their locality. So they took control of how their locality was being represented in the national media. It's a very simple strategy that they used, but it was also very effective. Right? And so over time, what you started to see was a kind of a lessening of these images being used. Now you still get them, but not to the same extent as you do anymore. So even things like that show, that these residents are very clued in, and they're getting results in terms of what they're doing. Another example would have been the whole issue there with the Northern Distributory Road at the back of my Ross, which had been promised under the initial regeneration plan, and then Minister Eamon Ryan had basically not sanctioned that section of the road to go ahead. And again, the Moyross residents got organised, ran a really powerful campaign, primarily on social media, which necessitated a rethink. And that section of the road was built, or is being built.
It's being built.
So that's a really powerful. Again, they made the argument around why that piece of the road was needed as a key piece of infrastructure for the regeneration of Moyross, economically, socially, physically, and they got their way. So if you compare that to how residents were engaged with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there's no comparison. The power differential has very much shifted. It hasn't gone the whole way, but it certainly has shifted quite significantly.
And Martin, would you see that? I mean, we can maybe finish on this point, but would you see that as community development, and would you see that? And I suppose, is that what community development starts to look like when you see that kind of shifting power, and that kind of greater assertiveness of communities in the face of state power? So is that part of what community development looks like? And I suppose beyond that, then, what would you see as the role of community development in a context like this, where this kind of stigmatization has been so normalized? What can community development usefully contribute or bring to it in terms of redressing the inequalities, the symbolic inequalities and the material inequalities involved?
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting one, really, because I suppose community development is not without kind of the having serious and numerous kind of difficulties that it has to overcome itself. So there are numerous challenges to a kind of an organized community development, and I'm thinking here in terms of community development organizations. As opposed to the broader community development as the empowerment of a community. But if you're talking about kind of formal community development organizations, I think there are numerous challenges to those kinds of organizations actually usefully challenging, symbolic and material forms of power that sustain the stigma that we've been talking about. So things like in Ireland in particular, the kind of clientelist nature of that sector, the legacy of the Celtic Tiger, and in particular what I'm talking about here is the social partnership arrangements, where the community development sector was essentially absolved or absorbed into the state and the way that the state does its business. The global dominance of neoliberalism, the growth of managerialism within the sector, the professionalization of community development, which on the one hand was a good thing, and on the other hand, it isn't necessarily a good thing in terms of the issues that we're talking about, because all of those things, I think, taken together in the round, essentially have resulted in the marginalization, I think, of social analysis. And in addition to that, I think the state has been playing a very explicit role in terms of the erosion of community development and exerting a much more, I suppose, a growing political influence on the whole process of community development, particularly around funding, and the requirement, or I suppose the natural instinct not to bite the hand that feeds, making projects fit what the funding is, rather than actually looking for funding for the projects that might be required. So there are specific kind of issues around that. However, that's not to say that community development can't and doesn't have a role to play, or that it can't or doesn't make a big difference in this regard. And I suppose I can think of two specific examples from Dublin, which evidence the kind of importance of community development organizations in resisting territorial stigma. And they would be the community development organizations in the regeneration projects in Fatima Mansions, and particularly in St. Michael's Estate in Inchicore, which saw very active community self-organization, huge emphasis on media capacity building, and empowering residents in actually engaging in agenda setting, and asserting themselves in negotiating terms with media producers, with editors, in actually controlling the narrative about the regeneration projects. And again, if you look at the Fatima Mansions, that's gone from being a hugely stigmatized locality in this country in the 80s to now essentially being the poster child that the state holds up in terms of this is a regeneration project that worked and why it worked. Now again, there's reasons why that was the case, and that I won't go into, but in particular the way that the community development organizations, in particular I'm thinking of kind of Rita Fagan's work in St. Michael's Estate, and she is involved in the family resource centres there, and John Bissett's book, Regeneration, Public Good or Private Profit, I think is just an amazing insight into that whole process in St. Michael's Estate. So there are two fantastic examples from Dublin, for example, of how organised community development, overcomes those very real barriers that are placed in its way. The whole process, which has depoliticized community development or organised community development. So that's a huge barrier. That process of depoliticization is a huge barrier to the effectiveness of community development. The more broader kind of community development in terms of the empowerment of the local communities, I think that has a massive role to play in all of this. And again, the example I gave you just a second ago about that road in my Ross, using I think the hashtag was Build Our Road. It initially targeted individuals within Limerick, then it started to widen out from that to target politicians in Limerick, then it started to target national politicians, and ultimately they got the minister to sit down and have a real think about what it was he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it. and it was changed. The decision was changed because that, you know, the permission for that section of the road was given the go ahead. Now, in the National Development Plan of a couple of weeks ago, the rest of that road wasn't given the go ahead, so that's been shelved. But that section of road from Ross. So if you think about that for a second, even in terms of the optics of this, right? So UL, you know, was particularly vocal in terms of the requirement to build the Northern Distributor Road in Limerick, you know, and when it wasn't part of the plan, the National Development Plan, you know, the president of UL, for example, spoke of her disappointment and how that has an impact for you know, for the university and the city as a whole. So we, you know, we as a university and as a city had been lobbying for that particular road. You know, the National Development Plan didn't pay attention to that. The Moyross residents lobbied for their section of that particular road, and they got it. So I think in the round, you know, if you're looking at kind of, or as I am, if I'm looking at our kind of 10 years of work, you know, that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago. You know, there was absolutely no way I could have pictured something like that happening 10 years ago, where the interests of the residents of Moyross would have taken precedence of the University of Limerick.
Maybe I shouldn't say this, but it sounds like a happy story in some ways.
No, well, it is. I mean, there's a long way to go with them. You know?
Yeah, but that does sound like a victory nonetheless, you know?
You know, they're still, you know, that was hugely punching above their weight in terms of the result they got from it. But it also, I like to think, at least, that it also shows them what's possible.
Yeah.
You know, and that if anything, hopefully it's given them the resolve to push on.
And shows other communities what's possible as well.
Exactly.
You know,
and push on and get what they're entitled to.
Yeah. And that it is a struggle and it is hard, but nonetheless that there are glimmers of hope and possibility coming from these different.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, in the paper we argue, you know, at the end, kind of somewhat depressingly, that maybe these acts of resistance to territorial stigma are, you know, they're quite limited, and you know, they in and of themselves they might seem immaterial. But every victory, I suppose, that the residents get in those areas is a victory for them. Yeah. And it's important for them, no matter how small it is. And, you know, and this is an ongoing process, and it's, you know, it's chipping away.
It is.
And you know, so I certainly wouldn't want to kind of rain on that parade, you know, in terms of saying it's, you know, it's irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. You know, and that last victory, I suppose, for the residents in Moyross is essentially that, you know, that it got a minister to change his mind. That's a big win.
That is significant, yeah. But I think as well, and I suppose just to sum up, I suppose it is that as well what you're also, and I think it's a big issue for the Community Development Journal, that's the name of the journal, but that doesn't mean we're evangelizing the positivity of community development all the time. That's not what it's about. We need to really be critically engaging with the different manifestations, the diverse manifestations of it. And, you know, sometimes community development is about institution building. It's institution building being done by the state. Sometimes it is more akin to social movement, you know, and sometimes it might manage to combine those two elements in really interesting types of ways. But also the kind of processes you've been describing, like professionalization, you know, the financialization, the rise of philanthropy, you know, like I might add as well as factors. These things are changing the landscape of how community development is done and the kind of the wriggle room that is possible for funded projects. And I think that's a really important issue that you've alluded to there as well, you know. So like even communities that are doing it successfully, you know, in terms of like how you're talking about in Dublin, it's still a struggle because they're having
absolutely.
You know, they're having to work around these strictures that have been put on them, you know.
Yeah. And that's, you know, again, I think that's, you know, that's hugely problematic. Effectively, you're asking them to do things with both hands tied behind their back, you know. And that, you know, even in terms of the long-term sustainability of that model to deliver for, because that's ultimately what community development is supposed to do. It's supposed to develop or to deliver for their communities. So the ability to keep doing that when your hands are tied behind your back, you know, long term, how sustainable is that really?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, and but again, it's, you know, it's hugely impacted upon by just the general acceptance of neoliberalism as the end of history, that, that's it, the game is over, neoliberalism is won, there's no alternative, there's nothing else, this is it, just get with the program. That's hugely problematic in terms of the ability for working class communities to throw off some of the the kinds of difficulties that they have to live with on a day-to-day basis as a consequence of the structural inequalities that exist in our society.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Maybe we leave it there then. That's been really fascinating. Thanks so much, Martin. So please do read the article, everybody. I think you'll be inspired to read it by this conversation. I really hope you have, because it's been so rich. And thanks to all the contributors in terms of the videos that we've been making. And we really do encourage people, once you've seen the video, pass it on, share it around, encourage other people to look at it as well. So we'll say goodbye to our viewers and listeners now. So bye-bye. And I'll just turn off the